All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So for this session, I prepared a presentation. So allow me to share my screen. Just give me a moment. Sorry, it's just taking a while. Can I confirm that my screen is visible to everyone right now?
Yeah, your screen is visible.
All right, thank you so much. So allow me to officially begin. Just to start, of course, lots of gratitude to the organizers of this event. I'm very grateful and honored to have been invited here. And I'm really excited to share some of the most important tips I've learned throughout the years when it comes to scoring debates. So that's what I'll be talking about for the next hour. I'll be sharing how you can improve how you score other debaters during a round, as well as how to use the score sheet during a debate. So this will be the outline of this presentation or of this lecture. Firstly, I'll just be shortly introducing myself once more. Then I'll proceed with a disclaimer about this presentation, and then we go to the presentation proper, where I'll be talking about a few things. Firstly, common buzzwords in the judge briefings, and then afterwards, the ranges of speeches, starting from below average to above average speeches. Then I'll be talking about best practices that you can adopt as an adjudicator. After that, some pitfalls to avoid, some common observations I've made throughout the years as well, and then lastly, how to use the score sheet. So to just get out of the way, and of course, I try to make this as interactive as I can. To those who don't know who I am, hi everyone. My name is Nicolas. I'm from the Ateneo Debate Society. As an adjudicator, some of my credentials include being rewarded as the overall best adjudicator of Australasian last year's Australs. I was ranked in the top 10 judges of Asia on 4 separate occasions. And currently, I serve on the adjudication core of tournaments as like Australs and formerly UADC in Princeton Ivy. Of course, I graduated from the Ateneo de Manila University with a degree in management engineering, and I currently work as a client relationship analyst. Sorry, saying that many times very quickly is quite difficult. But also some fun facts about myself, just to not make it all about work. My favorite sport's baseball. I was actually a varsity baseball player in college. I can do magic tricks with poker cards. I'd love to demonstrate, but online isn't exactly the best place to do magic tricks. My favorite video games, because I'm a very avid gamer, includes Breath of the Wild, Left 4 Dead, Infamous 1 and 2, Fallout 4, Pokemon Emerald. And my favorite cuisine, my favorite comfort food even, is Japanese cuisine, in particular udon. All right, so that's a bit about myself. Let's get to the presentation. So to everyone listening, there's 4 things I want people to keep in mind while we're going through this lecture. Firstly, this will be about British parliamentary formats. So there are many formats of debate out there. There's Asian parliamentary, there's the Australs format, there's the World Schools format, and each format has its own range, each format has its own guidelines, and it would take us much more than an hour, much more than just 2 hours to go through each format, to go through each range. And so for the purposes of which is most widely adopted and what you are more likely to encounter, we will be using the British parliamentary format and the range attached to the British parliamentary format. Nonetheless, take note that a lot of the tips that I will be sharing will still be can still be adopted, can still be used in other formats. So even if you don't often find yourself adjudicating British parliamentary debates, a lot of what I will be sharing now still apply to other formats. Secondly, of course, we'll be using the most updated BP format scoring range. That is the Korea WDC 2021 scoring range. Thirdly, both judging and scoring are intrinsically subjective. I actually think this is the most important disclaimer here. So the reason why I want to emphasize this is that ultimately, and then many times you'll find yourself disagreeing with me, disagreeing with other adjudicators about how to judge a round, disagreeing with other debaters about how they have been judged. And that's actually just part of the sport. That's just part of debate. And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with other people because that's really what we have to expect. That's why we rely so much on each other in debate. But with that being said, what I still think you can do, despite disagreeing with me, is take note that these are benchmarks, these are frameworks, and these are suggestions and recommendations. and if there's something you find comfortable or something that you think works for you best. That's what I think you should prioritize in this lecture. Simply, or to summarize that, you don't need to take everything I say here as truth. There can be some things that you agree with, there can be some things you disagree with, and that's totally fine. Lastly, the primary purpose of this lecture is really for foundational skills. So if ever there are more advanced questions you would like to bring up later on, that's fine. But note that for the main part of this presentation, I'll be talking about foundational skills when scoring. All right. So I think this is the first item, and I actually think this is the most important item here. What are the common buzzwords that people like to write in their judge briefings, and how do we interpret them? Because I imagine that everybody here has read a scoring range, and or at least has read multiple scoring ranges. But even if you haven't, allow me to elaborate. When you join tournaments, more often than not, they will tell you, look at this scoring range. This scoring range will be what we will be using. And it will tell you things like, an above average speech is very relevant. It's clear, it's easy to follow, it's logically demonstrated. And then it will say things like, a below average speech is not engaging, it's not charitable, it's a very vulnerable speech. But the scoring ranges themselves do very little to explain what these words mean. What's it mean when an argument is irrelevant? What does it mean when an argument is not logical? And up until we can all come into agreement about what those things mean, then the scoring range is useless. That's why, for this lecture, we'll be reviewing these words and these terms. I'll be using a lot of the experiences from my ADJ core past to explain what most adjudication core members have in mind when they use these things in their scoring ranges. And also, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. If at any point my audio sounds weird, or if I'm cutting off, anyone can interrupt me in the chat or unmute themselves to tell me that I'm being cut off, because I may not realize it and I may miss out on certain vital points. Okay, back to the presentation. From experience, there are six buzzwords that members of adjudication cores like to use when rating speeches. The first is relevance. So you hear this a lot. A speech is relevant when it creates compelling reasons for the motion to pass or fail. An above average speech has mostly relevant material. A below average speech has mostly irrelevant material. But what does relevance even look like? Let's use an example. Let's hypothetically say the motion was, this house would ban guns. Very basic motion. A relevant argument in this motion would sound similar to allowing for the sale of guns increases the risk of indiscriminate shootings because the sale of guns is likely to lead to more people having guns. And so to avoid this harm, the harm of indiscriminate shootings, we want to ban the sale of guns. We don't want guns. So it's relevant because a lot of talk surrounding the ownership of guns and people's right to bear arms surrounds protection, surrounds the deaths of innocent individuals. And so this argument is very relevant because it's tackling these things. An argument would be irrelevant, for example, if in that same motion somebody argued we should ban guns because it is not a profitable industry. In theory, any argument can be relevant if the debaters are able to explain why it is relevant, why it leads to a compelling reason for the motion to pass or to fail. But at that point, if a debater merely says it's a bad industry, it's not profitable, and refuses to elaborate further, it's clearly not a relevant argument anymore when throughout the rest of the debate, people have already been talking about things like the loss of innocent lives. So if you encounter an argument like that clearly isn't relevant to the primary shareholders of a motion, and these debaters refuse to elaborate further, that argument is irrelevant. And of course, if a speech contains exclusively irrelevant arguments, it's probably not a good speech. A speech that contains mostly relevant arguments is a very good speech. The second buzzword is logical. So to reiterate, arguments are logical when the relationship between the starting premise and the ending conclusion is clear. So let's use another hypothetical motion. Let's say the motion was, this house would ban the use of single-use plastics. So you'd ban things like straws, you'd ban things like plastic utensils. A logical argument would sound like this. Massive consumption of single-use plastics is harmful to the environment because the waste is poorly managed by most countries. That means most of the plastics after they've been used are not recycled
You're
and instead polluted in things. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, hello. Was I cutting off? Or sorry, my mistake. I'll just continue. Um, oh, and just a reminder, of course, to the observers, if you can keep yourselves mute while the lecture is happening, that would be very helpful. Okay, I shall continue. So back to the argument. Let's again, their single-use plastics are harmful to the environment because the massive consumption likely leads to poor waste management, which means instead of being recycled, plastics are dumped into the ocean, dumped into landfills. This kills marine life. This makes land unarable. Therefore, we should ban single-use plastics. That's a very good logical argument. It's clear why we should ban single-use plastics here because there's a starting premise that plastics are bad for the environment. They're poorly managed by waste companies. They end up being polluted. They're not recycled. It harms the environment. On another hand, if somebody argued we should ban single-use plastics because it leads to global warming and then refuses to elaborate why, it doesn't seem like a very logical argument because there's no clear connection between plastics being bad and global warming. So that's the distinction here. If a argument is like of the latter kind, which is, oh, plastics are bad, leads to global warming, that's not logical. That's not a logical argument because there's no clear relationship between bad plastic and global warming. But the first argument is a very good logical argument because it takes the time to explain to you why plastics in particular leads to a situation that harms the environment because it's not recycled, because it's poorly disposed of. It ends up in land, it ends up in the ocean, it doesn't degrade, and so it harms the environment. The third buzzword is clarity, and I think this might be a bit more straightforward. If an argument is easy to follow, it is clear. If it is not easy to follow, it is not clear. So let me try giving an example, but honestly, it's hard to think of a bad example here without like making it sound like a joke. Let's say the motion was this house believes that microfinance organizations have done more harm than good. A very bad argument would be microfinance organizations give high interests, which are bad, and because high interests are bad for the market, we should just make the motion fall. So that's not a very clear argument because why are there high interests in microfinance? Why are high interests bad to begin with? Why, in what way is the market affected? There's so many questions. Actually, I think that's the way to look at it. If at the end of an argument, you're left with more questions about the argument than you started with, it probably wasn't a good argument. On the other hand, if it was explained to you in this way, microfinance organizations might be harmful to society because, in an effort to remain competitive in the financial industry, they charge interests that are so high, its users are unable to pay them back. It's clearer to me as an adjudicator why high interests are bad and how they happen. Because these institutions need to remain competitive, and to outperform bigger banks, they charge or they give you a higher interest rate. Or sorry, they give you a loan in exchange for a higher interest rate. These high interest rates are bad though because it means you're more likely to default on your loan. If you default on your loan, this is harmful to the market because when you default on your loan, that means these banks are less liquid, which means these banks are less able to give services to other users of these banks. So it's a very clear argument. Or maybe it's not perfectly clear, but it's relatively much more clear than the other argument where someone just asserts that high interests are bad, doesn't explain why they're even high interests to begin with, and then asserts that it's affecting the market, but doesn't explain why the market would respond negatively to high interest rates. The fourth common buzzword is engagement, or when a speech is engaging. So this is where we start talking more about the relationship of an argument with the rest of their opponent's material. A speech is engaging when it is considerate of what other teams introduce in the debate. For example, let's say the motion was, this House believes that the state should pay reparations to women. And Prime Minister says this argument. Women are principally owed these reparations due to state failure creating the patriarchy leading to harmful discrimination. Opposition would not be engaging if their response was to suggest the state is not responsible for patriarchy. The reason why this is not engaging is, while on its own, it could be a good argument, there's definitely potential there. You explain why the state might not be directly responsible for discrimination, and therefore it's not technically the state's obligation to be directly paying reparations using taxpayers' money. However, it is not engaging the prime minister, who has already explained quite sincerely at this point that regardless of whether or not it's the state fault that discrimination exists, it's because of state failure, it's an error, it's an omission. Because of the state's omission of resolving the patriarchy, they have an obligation to pay. So at that point, opposition is not being engaging, because even if the argument on its own might be fine, because it's blatantly ignoring what the prime minister has already been talking about up until that point, that argument is not so engaging. Therefore, it's not the optimal argument at that point. It's not a good argument. And that's what most adjudication core mean, most members of adjudication core mean when they say an above average speech is engaging. It means that better teams are more likely to integrate their opponent's material into their own material so that they become better at rebuttal, better when weighing material against each other. When you don't do this, it's not compelling because it sounds like you're ignoring your opponent. It sounds like you're disregarding what they've said. So if you get the impression that a speaker is disregarding their opponent, is ignoring their opponent, they're not being engaging, and therefore the speech is likely not to be very good. The fifth common buzzword is charitability or charitable. And charitable itself has many interpretations. And in fact, it bleeds into a lot of the other buzzwords we've talked about so far. For example, a very good and very charitable team will likely be very engaging, will likely be very logical. But for the purposes of this lecture, charitability refers to how you interpret your opponent's arguments. And I'm sure if you've debated before, you've encountered this. When you run an argument that's really good, or at least something that you believe is personally very good, but your opponent blatantly misinterprets it for the benefit of their own speech, that is an opponent that is not being charitable. That is an opponent who is disregarding the effort you made into building that argument. And they are not being compelling by refusing to interpret your argument in the way in by which you communicated it. Let's use an example. This house regrets the romanticization of motherhood. If you're the prime minister and you explain that this romanticization is responsible for coercion that leads young women into a harmful lifestyle, that is a good argument. Or right at this point, let's say it's a good argument. If opposition responds to this, but the way they respond to it is to say, government up until this point just argues that being a mother is harmful, will disprove that being a mother is harmful. This is a very uncharitable interpretation of the prime minister, who doesn't say that being a mother is inherently harmful. They say that this coerces people into becoming mothers, which is not good for them. So at this point, opposition is not being charitable because they're not genuinely interpreting what the prime minister has said so far. And because of that reason, that rebuttal that follows opposition is not compelling, because that's not what government said. Why are we crediting opposition for responding to something that government bench never even said to begin with? And lastly, vulnerability. So I don't have an example here because I think similarly to clarity, this too is straightforward. Well, maybe not as straightforward as clarity, but I'll try my best to explain it. A speech is vulnerable when it is obviously lacking in necessary material. So for example, let's say the motion was this house regrets the euro. For everyone's benefit, the euro refers to the currency, the single currency that is used by all member states of the EU. That might not be 100% accurate, but I believe that captures the picture enough. If my argument was, this is harmful because it limits the options, it limits the trading options of countries, and then I refuse to elaborate, as an adjudicator, you'd be able to identify with common sense. This argument is probably lacking because this person refuses to elaborate. They've not given any structural reasons to believe why this is the case. They haven't told me what the impacts are, and they've never even connected this argument to the motion. So even if the opponents don't respond to this, because I can use my observation skills to identify that this argument is vulnerable, very vulnerable to responses, is very vulnerable to misinterpretation, it's probably not a good argument. And that's what this means. If you already have the impression, independent of any responses, that this argument itself is very bad and is very lacking in material, so much so that you don't believe a globally informed citizen would be compelled by it, that is probably not a very good argument. Before I proceed to the next part, let me just synthesize this one more time. Most adjudication courts will write a briefing, and they throw these buzzwords a lot. The average speech, the 75 speech, will be somewhat logical, somewhat relevant, somewhat charitable. And to their credit, they're probably correct when they say these things. But what they often forget to do is elaborate on what they mean by these words and just hope that everybody's on the same page. From experience, using my experience, I've done my best to try to synthesize what all the adjudication courts I've been a part of have agreed on and what they mean by these words. So when an adjudication core member tells you a bad speech is not logical, it's not clear, it's not charitable, it's very vulnerable, it's not engaging, and it's not relevant, hopefully at this point, you have a better idea of what they mean. When they tell you that an argument is logical but not clear, hopefully you can understand why that argument might be good in the logical dimension but not so in the clarity dimension. If someone tells you that the argument is relevant and logical but not engaging, hopefully you can see what you can credit that argument for, but what you should not credit that argument for, hearing that it has some merits but also has some cons. So with that, let's now go to the next part. The next part is just talking about the ranges of speeches. So this actually won't take too much time because you'll notice a pattern very soon. Let's start with the below average speeches. A below average speech is a score where you would give either a 50 or scores between 50 and 72. So what are these speeches? These are speeches where arguments are frequently irrelevant, frequently lacking in logical development, are very difficult to follow, and are not engaging with the rest of the debate. Moreover, they also have very frequent and noticeable mishaps. Very often, the arguments will have deficits. Very often, they are vulnerable. Note, however, that at this point, the range of 50 to 72 is very large. That is around 22 possible scores, 23 possible scores that you can give a below average speech. The way to go about it is to use, honestly, your subjective judgment or your gut feel, as some people refer to it. So many speeches can quote unquote be called lacking in logical development, but some speeches are even more lacking in logical development than others. So with that in mind, use your subjective judgment to, if you're certain that a speech is below average, use your subjective judgment to identify if it's a very bad speech that probably deserves a line of 6, that is to say it's from 60 to 69, or if it's just slightly below average, therefore it should probably still get a 72. I will elaborate later on, however, how to better use the below average scale. Just note that the eventual point that I'll get to is that you'll hardly ever give lines of 5 and low lines of 6s, because these scores are reserved for people who are just quiet the entire speech or spend the entire speech saying actively harmful things to the rest of humanity. All right, let's now go to average speeches. So average speeches are speeches that get scores from 70 to 78. There are 3 common features of average speeches. Firstly, they're the most abundant kind of speech. Or what I mean by that is, you are very likely going to give, well, sorry, I realize this is a typo, my mistake. Below average speeches are 50 to 72. This is supposed to be 73, my mistake. Just for the purposes of the recording, just take note, this 70 is supposed to be a 73. So average speeches are the most abundant kind of speeches. Note that despite the average speech literally only being from 73 to 78, meaning that there's only 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's only 10 possible scores you can give an average speech. Wait, no, sorry, that I'm not thinking straight anymore. There's only 8 possible scores. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, oh my gosh. No, 6. I'm embarrassing myself in front of everyone because of my very poor math skills. I apologize. The point being, despite there being very few average speeches in terms of number, you are very likely going to give a debater these scores. It's almost unlikely you will never encounter, or almost entirely likely that the whole room will consist of scores that range from 73 to 78. Because as the title suggests, these are the average speeches. These are the people you are very likely to encounter in a debate tournament And these are the scores they are expected to get. If you find yourself in an average room, the winners are likely to get scores of 78 and 77, and so on and so forth for the rest of the teams that don't win in that round. So maybe they'll go 1 point lower, so on and so forth, going down the list. These arguments are generally relevant. So most arguments are relevant, almost all are logically developed, and very few mishaps are encountered often during these speeches. I want to make a note here. Sometimes a slightly above average speech will have two very good arguments and one bad argument. At that point, it's again your subjective judgment to identify if this is still an above average speech or an average speech. Because, yes, while it says here that most, if not all, arguments are relevant for an average speech, it doesn't mean I run 5 arguments, 4 are perfect, the 5th is horrible. Therefore, it's no longer true that most arguments are relevant. Therefore, I must get a below average speech. It's possible for you to offset that penalty by having 4 very good arguments in that point in time. So, what am I trying to get at here? It goes back to the disclaimer. This is really just a framework. This is a point of reference. Not all average speeches share these common features. In fact, there will be many average speeches that are anomalous to these features. There might be an above average speech that has mostly bad arguments, but because the one good argument was so compelling it won them the debate, they should still earn that above average score. They should still earn that high average score. And what this is supposed to serve as is a point of reference. If you think that speech with the one perfect argument and 3 bad arguments was still good enough and probably good enough to beat another speech that has most arguments which are relevant and most arguments which are illustrated clearly, then it is better than the average speech that we've agreed on here today. It's better than the average speech that we have right now. And with that being said, what then is the above average speech? So these are the speeches where you give 79 to 100. These are arguments that are entirely relevant. These are arguments that are strongly resistant to mishaps. I don't think I need to elaborate further. If an above average speech is very likely to have 0 bad arguments, it's likely to be very compelling. And yeah, it's also probably very resistant to mishaps. So something I forgot to mention earlier. In an average speech, don't punish an average speech because you yourself believe you can respond to it. It's not the prime minister's fault that they are running an argument that is susceptible to responses. There's a difference between an argument being vulnerable and an argument being responded to. Because even the best speech and the best argument in the world will be responded to. You shouldn't punish that speaker for having a material that can be responded to. Instead, we punish speeches that are explicitly vulnerable to good arguments because there are clear lacking mechanisms in them. We credit as it is arguments that aren't perfect, but do have enough material to withstand rebuttal. And then for above average speeches, we strongly reward speakers that are going above and beyond, putting effort into explaining why their material can either strongly withstand rebuttal or mitigate rebuttal. Speakers do this via either things like preemptions, added framing, strong premises that are illustrated clearly. We reward teams who do this, and that's how they often get above average scores. Let's go to some best practices when scoring. And I want to mention something here as well, before we get to best practices. Similarly to earlier, when I said you're unlikely to give anyone 50 to 65. Like, even the worst speech in worlds will probably not even touch the line of 6. Or if they do, it must have been an atrocious debate. Similarly, in an above average speech, you're almost never going to give higher than an 85. For context, and I'll be elaborating on this further later, the best speaker of the world in Korea WDC this year, which is the largest tournament in the world this year, scored an 84. What that means is, if you're giving somebody an 85 or an 86, you are telling the world you think this is actually the best speaker in the world. You think this speech you're giving an 85 to trumps the best speaker of the world because the best speaker of the world only got an 84, but you think this person deserves an 86. So what that means is, despite the range itself being from 79 to 100, you're likely only going to use, for above average speeches, 79 to 84, 79 to 85. For people who are asking themselves right now, then why do we have 87 to 100. My response is, I don't know. I wasn't the author of the original briefing. I'm just going as it is. I'm just sharing how the circuit navigates it. I wish I could tell you why they still bothered to make 88 to 100 when no one gets these scores, but that's not me. So let's continue. What are some best practices in scoring? So up until this point, we have been discussing just to recap, up until this point, we've discussed two things primarily. Firstly, the common jargon that members of adjudication course use to describe what an average, an above average, and a below average speech are. Secondly, I've also identified common features for you to use independent of the previous item for seeing whether or not a speech is above average or below average. But sometimes you're just in a room and you just don't know what just happened. There are still some best practices you can adopt to arrive at the accurate range, or at least the most accurate range in a round. So these are my two tips. Firstly, consult your panelists. Of course, whenever you're judging a room, it's always to remember that the panelists are there to help each other. That the reason why the adjudication core put a panel there is that they know this room is tough, and they know that to give the decision its due diligence, multiple people need to work together to arrive at the most accurate decision. The decision isn't the only thing the adjudication core want you to work on. It's also the range. The adjudication core want you to discuss what is the best range to use for the round. And so if ever you found yourself at the end of a debate, you already know who won, but you don't know whether or not they were great or awful or average, don't be afraid to consult your panelists for the score. Because I've encountered chairs who previously believed it's their sole responsibility to arrive at the score. No, that's not necessarily the case. You're more than welcome to, after arriving at a decision, just telling your panelists, okay, let's decide the scores now. Can you tell me what you think the scores are? Then they'll tell you, I think the winning team, their best speaker got a 78. The other person will say, maybe it was a 76. Let's meet in the middle. Maybe it was a 77. That's something you can adopt. So the implication, of course, here being maximize your resources. If you're a chair, your panel is there to help you. If you're a panel, make sure to help your chair identify these scores because maybe they too are struggling with it. The second tip is to identify a benchmark. So some of you might also be wondering at this point or thinking to yourself that, oh, wow, so many steps need to be taken to identify a score. And admittedly, yeah, it's a struggle each and every debate. Not that's something I'm sure we can all relate to. It's a struggle. However, one thing I've learned is that in instances where some speeches are particularly difficult to decipher, you can always just identify one speaker and use them as a benchmark. For example, let's say there was a winning team, but you have a hard time crediting the winning team. You don't know what score to give them. But you're absolutely convinced that the second place team, their best speaker got a 79. Use that as your framework. Okay, up until this point, I don't know what to give the winning team. I thought it was close between the first place and the second place team. I'm convinced that the second place team, both speakers are getting a 79. Maybe the winning team should both get 80s. Maybe the winning team should both get 81s. And then similarly for the losing team, you don't know how bad they did. You thought it was quite clear between them and second place. Maybe you can give them a 75, 76, because there should be a clear margin between them and the second place team. You don't anymore have to start from scratch. I didn't really like it. Who knows what they should get, 78, 72. You can use other speeches in the round as the framework or the point of reference for scoring other speeches. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is, as from previous experience as well, some judges will use the range for every speech. So they'll pull out the range, and for the prime minister, they'll say, do you think the prime minister met this criteria? Then we'll agree, we'll disagree. We go to the deputy prime minister, we do that for the leader of opposition, so on and so forth. Next thing we know, the scores don't even match to the decision anymore. So with that being said, it's always good to, or in my opinion, it's a better practice to start with a point of reference. Do you either start with the winning team and you say, I think they deserve this score, or you start with something that you all agree on. We all agree this team should get 79. Let's then base our scores for the rest of the teams up on the 79 that we've given this one speaker. So these are the best practices I used. Here are some pitfalls to avoid. So I identified six. So, firstly, don't score by the number of arguments. So, of course, if a speech is five arguments, that doesn't necessarily mean all five arguments are good. You don't give a speaker more points because they ran more things in a round. Instead, you look at each individual argument and ask yourself, how impactful really was this on the debate? Secondly, a speaker is not automatically bad if they speak for less than 7 minutes. So this might be a bit controversial, but let me explain. Yes, in theory, if I only spoke for 2 seconds, that probably means it's a bad speech. But not all 5 minute speeches are bad. Not all 6 minute speeches are bad. And most importantly, not all 7 minute and 30-second speeches are good. Sometimes speakers waste time by overextending. They spend minutes saying useless things and they overtime as a result. And in other times, speakers are so concise, they can win the entire debate by saying the most important thing in less than 5 minutes. And they themselves realize there's no point in continuing, so they stop at the 5 minute mark. It's not wrong for them to speak these ways. It's not wrong for someone to say, I think I've already ran all I needed to run to win this round and stop at the 5 minute mark if they truly believe they had won the debate at that point. Instead, your responsibility as an adjudicator is to look at the merit of their material. As someone who has personally won debates before when I was still in high school by only speaking for 5 minutes, and the feedback I would get is that in 5 minutes I do a better job than other debaters who spoke for 7 minutes. Judges should not think a 5 minute speech is probably a novice and this 7 minute 30 speech is a tenured debater. I should give the 7 minute 30 speech the win. No, that's not always the case. Because if, for example, again, in the 7 minute 30 speech, I run five arguments that are all very poorly illustrated, very irrelevant. But in my 5 minute speech, I run two arguments that directly engage with that 7 minute 30 speech, directly rebut all the material that they use. That 5 minute speech probably wins, and you should credit them accordingly. Thirdly, don't score by confidence. So this is a iteration of a very commonly told criticism. Don't score by confidence. Don't score solely because of style. Don't score because of accent. Don't score someone because you think they touched you with their tone, touched you with their voice. Yes, these things are useful. These things are compelling, but they shouldn't be the demarcation for the score. They are just simply tools in by which they assist the adjudicator in crediting your material. For example, if I say an argument in a very compelling, confident manner, the way I judge or the way I grade that argument isn't to say the argument was clear, it was compelling, and it was said nicely. No, I can say that argument nervously as well. It should still get the same score. The difference is if I say it confidently, that confidence is supposed to better help me communicate that to the judge, and that judge is supposed to better receive it because of confidence. And that's not when I say should, I mean that as a psychological response. We have a psychological and unconscious bias to be more favorable towards people who sound confident and who sound like they believe in themselves. That's why we try to train ourselves to sound more confident. It isn't because there's an expectation that confident sounding arguments are better than nervous sounding arguments. Is that we recognize we all have subconscious biases, unconscious biases that we can't avoid. That no matter how many times I tell myself a confident person isn't always smarter than someone who sounds nervous, the fact of the matter is we have that bias and therefore we need to actively curb that bias. With that being said, we should not score on the basis of tone. We should not score on the basis of nervousness. If on paper, notes that you've taken, you've convinced yourself that both arguments are equally compelling, there's no reason to say, oh, but that person sounded more confident, therefore I should give them more points. Instead, let them speak the way in which they would want to speak. You digest the arguments in the way you would like to digest them. And you credit it for the material that they communicate to you, and not the style in by which they've said it. The fourth thing here is by responsiveness. So this one is a bit more common in the Asian circuit. Admittedly, I'm not so sure if it's true in other circuits, but what happens in the Asian circuit is judges are a bit more vindicative or a bit more. I'm trying to find the right word for it. Judges are mean. There we go. Judges are mean to first speakers. Judges like to credit responses so much more than substantive material that a lot of times deputy speakers and whip speakers get far more points than the prime minister, than the member. And the reason for that is frankly because judges have a bias for responsiveness rather than material. And similarly to earlier, that there's an unconscious bias that people have with regards to how confident you sound. Similarly, we have an unconscious bias with regards to responses. That is to say, we appreciate material that is more clearly engaging the opponent, that's more clearly fighting a battle in the round. It's hard to visualize the impact of a preemption in a round because it requires the adjudicator to moderately step in and understand what the preemption does to later material. On the other hand, a response is straightforward. They said this, what they said is wrong. They said this, what they said is not true. And because it's easier to digest then, judges have a bias towards favoring responsiveness more than first speakers in a round. That shouldn't be the case, of course, because preemptions are just as important as responses. And so, as much as possible, curb any biases you might have to favor rebuttals more than the prime minister's substantiation or a leader of opposition's preemptions. Fifthly, don't score by expectations. Some judges I've encountered, and I won't out I won't out people, but most especially adjudication core members, are disappointed in the round when they hear something that they did not expect people to run. So, if you remember earlier, my motion, this house would ban single-use plastics. It could be that the adjudication core member really wanted this to be an environmental debate. That in the back of their mind, they thought government and opposition will argue whether or not this was truly something we should do in the environmental movement. But then the debate, for example, delves into whether or not single-use plastics, I don't know, benefit the consumerist society for other reasons. It's not up to the adjudication core member to say, they ran things that weren't in my mind. This is probably a bad debate then. No. You should judge the debate as it happens. Just because the issues and the arguments were what you expected them to run doesn't mean the arguments are bad. It just means that these people have a different take on it than you. It just means they have different priorities. It just means maybe because of a different background, other things are more important to them. That is nobody's fault. And most especially not the debater's fault. That they don't know how to read your mind ahead of time in a tournament where they don't even know who the judges are less than 30 minutes before the rounds even begin. What that means is it's okay for you to have expectations. Like, I'm not saying have zero expectations, that's unavoidable. But if ever you find yourself saying, I thought they should have ran something else and that would have made the debate better, that's a red flag. Never tell yourself they should have ran this. Instead, just look at what they say and ask yourself, is what they said good? Is what they said bad? And if what they said was good, credit them. If what they said was bad, they probably lost the debate. Lastly, and this is the last pitfall, scoring solely by rank. So this one's quite simple. The best speaker of the round doesn't always have to come from the winning team. It's entirely possible that the team that got second had the best speaker of the round, but then the partner dropped the ball. And so, for example, it could be the case that opening government got second and closing opposition got first. But the scores are the prime minister gets an 80, the deputy prime minister gets a 75. That's a radical example. And then closing opposition, they both get 79. So that's fine, that's possible. Just because they won doesn't mean they had the best speaker. It's your responsibility as the adjudicator to holistically assess a team and their performance, but also reward individual performance if certain people did shine and others really did fail. So, two more pitfalls. These are pitfalls I mentioned earlier. Don't score too lowly. It's very rarely you'll ever give anyone lower than 65 because in practice, these are scores we really reserved for example, somebody shows up, introduces themselves, and then walks away, which of course never happens. Or somebody walks up and literally just proceeds to say all forms of slurs and their favorite four-letter words and then leaves. Obviously, these are all effectively say nothing. These are the only times you'll ever give scores lower than 65. And in fact, in other times, even worse things than 65, so they'd probably be kicked out of the tournament by equity if they did the latter example, or be approached by an organizer of the tournament if they did the former, that is to say, they just introduced themselves. However, and again, sorry, I'm mumbling the transition words. As a framework or as a benchmark, if I'm not mistaken, the lowest ranking speakers of worlds still ranked higher or still averaged higher than 71. So even at the point in which you find yourself in a bin room, unless they speak so atrociously bad that they say nothing at all, you're almost never going to be giving scores lower than 65. And again, for the things I mentioned earlier, you're almost never going to be give scores higher than 84 because even the best speaker of the world only averaged an 84. So unless you're absolutely certain that the speech you just heard is better than the best speaker of the world, you're probably not going to use the 85 to 100 part of the range. That actually concludes the bulk of the lecture. This next part is a very foundational part of the lecture. How do you use the scoring sheet? Of course, there are many different tabulation softwares out there, and each tabulation software has a different format. But the most common is what you'll see here, where you'll simply be asked to say, oh, you'll simply be asked to write the names of each member of the team and put their score next to their name. So in this instance, you'd put their score to the right. In other instances, you'll put it below. In other instances, you'll put it above. But what's always present in a ballot is that you get the names correct and that you get their scores correct. I didn't put it in the table here, but often you're also asked to solve for the total. So obviously the total is the sum of the two scores. Make sure you always have a calculator with you whenever you're adding these scores. And yeah, that actually is it. So firstly, thank you all so much for listening. I apologize if at different points I was either mumbling or dragging, but let's do a Q&A. Are there any questions from anyone or any clarifications anybody wants to make?
Yes, please. I have a question.
Sure thing.
Okay, concerning the scoring by rank, you see, when a particular team gets first, and like you don't give them the higher scores there, you realize that when you give the higher scores to the other teams, you end up getting a tie in your score sheet. So like, does it mean that you have to give let's say Oo was the best speaker, so does it mean you have to increase the leader of opposition's marks and reduce the deputy leader of opposition marks, or what do you do since it might end up being a tie?
Okay, so I like that question. What I would do then is I would reevaluate. Firstly, I would reevaluate if the speaker that I'm giving a really high score truly gave a speech of that quality. If by giving them that score, they in theory would have won the debate. Let me see if I can get like a pen tool here. Will this let me? Sorry, I'm talking to myself here. Will this let me write? Nope, it does not. Ugh, ugh, ugh. Um, um. Can I use the Zoom's own? There we go. Let me see here. Draw. So let's say the prime minister got a 70. Oh, sorry, here. Let's say the prime minister got a 77. The member of opposition got a 78. And the opposition whip also got a 78. So in theory, or the situation you're telling me, right, is if I give the deputy prime minister 79, the problem is even if I think closing opposition won, at this point they've just tied, and that can't happen. So you're asking me, what should I do here? The first thing I would do here is ask myself if the deputy prime minister truly deserves a 79. Maybe they actually deserve a 78 after all. Maybe they just sounded better than closing opposition, but they were probably just as good as them. Or you ask yourself if the prime minister should get even lower. So yeah, that's it. Those are the two alternatives you can use. If you find yourself in this situation where again, closing opposition won the debate, so they're the first, and opening government got the second, and you think the deputy prime minister is the best speaker, so in theory, this is the conundrum you find yourself in. You either decrease the deputy prime minister score, so you make it a 78. So you disagree with the initial premise that they were actually the best speaker in the round. You tell yourself, oh, maybe they were just as good as CEO. Or you really tell prime minister that they dropped the ball and you decrease the prime minister's score to make it even lower. I hope that answers your question. Those would be the two things I would do.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, there's a
I have
question in the
one.
chat.
There's
I'll
a
just
question that says this.
yeah, I'll answer the question in the chat first, and then the person who unmuted themselves, you can ask me your question later. How do you know an argument lacks material in grading, or whether it's vulnerable or not? This is because the average judge doesn't come in with knowledge, and they shouldn't place that knowledge. Okay, so an adjudicator is a globally informed citizen. Whoops, I'm still in annotate mode. How do I leave this? Okay, an adjudicator is a globally informed citizen. And yes, what that means, you can't step in. It means you have a degree of common sense. So, for example, let's say, I'm running out of sample motions. Let's say the motion, use this house would ban guns again. And my argument was, we should ban guns because killers use guns. And then I refuse to elaborate. So in theory, if opposition doesn't respond to this, it stands true. But you, as the adjudicator, you should have the common sense to know that it's a much more complicated issue than that. That killers will either one resort to probably a different murder weapon if they really want to murder their victims, to likely use the black market to still access firearms, even if you ban the sale of firearms. And so, even if what Prime Minister says at that point is true, your use of common sense is enough to tell you that that argument is not perfect, that that argument has some flaws in it already. And I think that's the more important question here. How do you know when you can use your own knowledge in a debate? You can use your own knowledge if you believe that the common sense of a globally informed citizen is enough to reduce the persuasiveness of the claim. So another example would be, if indeed this house would ban single-use plastics argument, Prime Minister says it's harmful to the environment because of pollution, and opposition just says no, single-use plastics are good for the environment. Common sense would probably tell you that that's not true. Common sense that goes along the lines of single-use plastics being non-biodegradable. It takes centuries for them to totally disintegrate in soil, much longer in the ocean. And so this opposition speaker is probably lying when they say it's good for the environment. Even if the deputy prime minister doesn't directly respond to the leader of opposition and say that's wrong, your common sense is enough to tell you that that argument is vulnerable, that that argument is not true. I hope that answers your question. To summarize again, it's use what you think the globally informed citizen would use as their common sense in asking yourself whether or not an argument is vulnerable. So there's one more question. Do you want to share it? Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right. You talked about how you can always consult the chair or panelists. So usually what happens in the room is that when it comes to scoring, a chair could have given the speakers really low scores. And as a panelist, you felt these speakers like really deserved high scores. I mean, how then do you de-escalate that whole situation? Because usually as a panelist, you are afraid to clash with the judge because you think he or she may not give you good feedback. So usually there is that problem where a chair has really given the speakers it's given the speaker like a 76, yet you really felt the speaker deserved like a 78. So I don't know, or just concede and accept the chair. I don't know. What do you think is the best way to de-escalate that?
Sure thing. Actually, I really like that question because the root of that question is actually a far more important and relevant question in the debating circuit. What if the panelist just disagrees with the chair and their chances of breaking are put at risk? The honest answer to this is it's difficult because even like if people are members of debate serious posting the Facebook group, you'll know that people are still hotly contesting what to do for the situation. because there is no obvious solution and there are no safeguards in place to remedy that. Because I agree with you 100%. I too am terrified that when I'm a panelist, my chair is just going to give me a very low score for no fault of mine, but because the chair feels that because I thought the debate had a higher rating or because I thought someone else won, that I'm a poor judge and therefore I should lose. The problem, so I agree, it's a very bad problem that needs solving and there is no clear solution, and that's why it's so problematic. And even I don't know what to do in that situation. I do have these things to share to at least mitigate the fears. One, chairs of this nature, where a chair who is very likely to dismiss the panel, a chair who is very likely to disregard the panel's opinion, will probably not chair many rounds. It probably means this is true because they're a bad adjudicator. Hopefully, the tournament self-corrects itself when they give the bad oral adjudication the wrong range, and they get rated lowly for it, and the panelists rate them lowly for it, and so they end up not chairing anymore. So that's the one theoretical self-correcting mechanism here to mitigate the number of bad chairs panelists find themselves with. But to directly answer to the question again, honestly, if you it's a very, very complex, complicated issue, and there is no clear answer on what to do there. That really is it. So instead of answering the question, instead I'll just share a message. If you're the chair of a round, do not do what this hypothetical chair we're talking about does. Do not penalize your adjudicators, your panelists, for having a different decision than you, for having a different range than you, because your panelists are not your enemies. They're there to help you, because that's the whole reason they're there. If the adjudication court trusted you enough, they would have made you the solo chair of that room. If the room was simple enough, you would have been in that room alone, and the other panelists would have been used elsewhere where they were more needed. The reason that you're all there is because you're supposed to help each other. So do not rate each other lowly for disagreeing. Nobody is a perfect judge. Nobody can look at a round and say 100% for sure that they know the correct call here, because there is no objective call. Everything is subjective. Debate is intrinsically subjective. And if you refuse that premise and think you're right, they're wrong, you have totally contradict the purpose of debate anyway. If there is a right or wrong, there is no debate. There is just a right or wrong. We debate because we're trying to approximate, predict, estimate what this right is, what this wrong is. And you refusing to allow others to participate in that fundamentally destroys the founding premise of debate. So that was a lot. I will synthesize that again. What do you do in that situation? It's a very complicated issue. I wish I could just tell you to disagree with the chair and explain your disagreement, but it really isn't that simple. And as a circuit, we should all work together in making that it is not the case that panelists feel like they are always at danger of being unjustly hurt by their chairs. With that being said, for next steps, chairs, please be kind and considerate to your panelists. The third thing, and this is what I will say, if despite these fears, you will still choose to disagree with your chair, here is how I will do it. Firstly, make sure you are very clear. Say, let's say the Prime Minister is getting 76 from the chair. You can say this, if I can add my input, Madam, Mr., or just chair, I actually do think the opening government deserve higher scores than that. In fact, I would give the Prime Minister a 78. My reasons for this are as follows. Then you can cite the common features I mentioned earlier. Despite them I think when they won the debate, they did so because they had very compelling material. At no point did I think any of their arguments were illogical. In fact, I think they do a lot of things to put effort into preempting their opponents. These are all indicative of an above average speech, because more often than not, you won't encounter speeches that use these preemptions, that use these premises. So I don't think they were the best speeches, which is why I probably won't give them a 79 or an 80. But I don't think they should get 76, because I don't think they're an average prime minister. I think they're definitely above average. Note what I do there. One, make it clear to the chair that I'm not actively against them, that I'm not disagreeing with them for the sake of disagreeing with them. I'm communicating to them that this is really just my personal opinion of the debate. Secondly, I cite evidence. And I think this is the thing that a lot of panelists don't do. Cite evidence when you make a claim. Don't just say, I think they should get higher and then move on. Say, I think they should get higher for these reasons. One, I think their preemptions were very good. I don't think most speakers would have used these preemptions to mitigate the responses from CO. And I thought that was quite compelling in the round. I would have given, I think for that reason, that's one of the reasons I would give them a higher score than 76. Then you list the rest of your reasons using evidence, using things that happened in the round. So I hope that actually, I think that last thing answers your question. If the question of what do I do if my chair is bad, very difficult to answer. But if you'd still choose to challenge the chair, that's what I would do. Cite evidence when you're stating your reasons.
Yeah, it answers. Thanks a lot.
There's another question in the chat. What about abusive speakers in a round? Equity concerns been violated. In a case where a speaker pushes forth that the opponent point be reduced because of equity violation, what can you do then? Okay, so this is actually unrelated to scoring. This is more of a judge briefing. What do you do if there's an equity violation in the round question? And that's a good question. Firstly, if there's an equity violation, you wait for the round to finish before you contact the equity team. So that's step one, or at least that's number one thing to keep in mind. The winning team doesn't, or sorry, not winning team. The violating team doesn't automatically lose because of an equity violation. And to be frank, that's because equity violations come in a spectrum. It could be that the prime minister misgendered the leader of opposition, and that is an equity violation that should be shamed. But for all intents and purposes, maybe the prime minister gave an excellent speech while misgendering the leader of opposition, and the prime minister should be punished after the round by the equity team, but that shouldn't change the fact that they won the debate if they really did beat the leader of opposition despite misgendering them. So what's the point of trying to get here? The first thing here is that we have to distinguish decision making from responding to equity violations, because they're separate things. It's possible for a team to commit equity violations and still not rank fourth in a round, because for using the rules of debate, equity violations aren't things you penalize. They're things you ignore for when scoring a team. So for all intents and purposes, that 1 minute in their speech where they're committing the equity violation, the chair heard nothing. Like it was as if they had disconnected and you only heard silence for that 1 minute. Then you just judge the rest of the debate accordingly. So to answer the first layer of the question, how does an equity violation affect the decision? When the equity violation happens, you still credit everything that said that wasn't an equity violation. But that equity violation, you keep in mind enough that you tell the equity team later what happened. But you don't go to the decision say, they got fourth because they misgendered the leader of opposition. They got fourth because they said this slur. No, instead you just say, I would like to remind teams during your oral adjudication, either at the beginning or the end, I would like to remind teams to be more mindful of their language, because they can, in instances whether or not intentional or unintentional, lead to triggering members of the debate, either by bringing up unnecessary harmful emotions by using certain words, or by triggering them using certain pronouns that don't belong to them. In addition to bringing it up in the oral adjudication, you can also say in between speeches, please be mindful of the gender pronouns of members of the round. Please use gender neutral language as a default if you're not aware what the pronouns are or what the genders of the participants are. If there is a repeated instance of equity violation, that is to say, a team it's not just like one instance, like their entire speech is dedicated to an equity violation, there's really only so much you can do as the adjudicator, to be perfectly honest. I would say, firstly, let them finish their speech. You never interrupt the speaker. Let them finish their speech. You contact equity team. You quickly describe to them what's going on. But at the same time, you also just mention in between that speech and the next speech, please be mindful of the language you use, and then repeat the things I said earlier about the risks of committing equity violations. So to synthesize that, does an equity violation affect the decision? Technically, it should not. Does it affect what you do in the round as a judge? Yes. So what do you do as a judge? Firstly, you contact the equity team so that they can take the correct next steps for addressing the situation. You don't interrupt the speaker. Instead, you wait for them to finish their speech, and you remind the round in between speeches to be mindful of the risks of equity violations. And you also repeat that in your oral adjudication. I hope that answers your question. So, okay, I'm reading the follow-up question. There are two questions in the chat. I'll answer the first follow-up question, then I'll answer the second question. Well, the issue there is actually that the the team, the people here who are in the wrong are the people committing the equity violation and the other speakers, because the other speakers cannot demand an automatic sanction. So admittedly, that is the also, so a third person who's at fault here is the adjudication core and not you, the chair, because it's the responsibility of the adjudication core to communicate this to the rest of the tournament, that if there is an equity violation, the judge chair, there's only so much they can do. They cannot. The reason why there's an equity committee is because we want to standardize the approach to equity violations, and so the teams can't just demand action from the chair to respond to an equity violation. There's actually a very good analogy here. So I think a good analogy here is that similarly to physical first aid, there's mental health first aid. And like a physical aid, in like an injury, like if I break a bone, it's always better for someone who is familiar with physical first aid to help me. If there's a injury, like an equity violation, for the purposes of this discussion, let's say an equity violation is an injury to the emotional state of a member of the debate. You don't want any random person just treating your broken bone, right? Like if I break my bone, I don't want some random person to go in the street and patch me up. I want someone familiar with physical first aid to help me. Similarly, if there is an injury that takes place because of equity violation, which is very similar to a mental health injury, you don't just want the random chair to be fixing the issue. You want someone who is trained, who is prepared to respond to the situation. You want the equity team to respond to the situation. So as the teams, you can't just be demanding random people, hey, help me, this thing happened. Like, yes, you have a right to ask for help, but to demand help from particular individuals, that's not something you can do, especially when the tournament already has designated people to be responding to these situations. So synthesizing that, I am very sorry you had to encounter both a team committing this equity violation and teams demanding you in particular for action, because that's not what was supposed to happen. I'm so sorry you had to experience that. I think if ever you did I think you did the right thing if you contacted the equity team. If the teams got mad at you for that, I apologize. But these teams should not have gotten mad at you. Instead, you did the right thing in contacting the equity team, because it's not your responsibility to be responding and fixing these equity violations. It's your responsibility to contact the equity team and they fix it. The next question. I don't know if this was covered while I had glitches. The question is it possible that the best speaker in a team that ranks 4th or 3rd? Yes, but wow. It is possible, but that other speaker really must have dropped the ball. Like, in math, like, using, strictly speaking, anything is possible in debate. So let me use my drawing tool again. Whoops. How do I undo that? I'm just going to hide the chat very quickly. It is not out of question that Prime Minister got an 81, but then the Deputy Prime Minister really, really dropped the ball, so they got a 70. And then let's say 77, 77. Or just to make it quicker, then everyone here gets 78. Then everyone here gets 79. That is possible. So for all intents and purposes, the best speaker can come from any team. It's just, I don't know what would happen in the round that this is your outcome. Because admittedly, I've never experienced it personally. But in theory, that is very much possible. Are there any more questions? I think I can accommodate 1 or 2 more questions.
I have a question.
Sure thing.
Okay, what are the risks of breaking equity policy?
Okay, so the risks of breaking an equity policy: 1, you cause undue emotional distress to members of the tournament. And so, if you truly are a considerate and humane individual, you would respect that other people join debate because they believe it's a safe space for discourse and that they will not be unruly attacked for their opinions. By committing equity violations, you take away this characteristic of debate. Debate ceases to be a safe space for these people. And so that is not welcome in debate. So, sorry, I said what the risk was and the principle behind the risk. But the risk really is you cause undue harm to people who don't deserve this kind of harm. And so you shouldn't be committing equity violations. What are the kinds of equity violations you can infringe upon? You can unnecessarily trigger harmful memories of an individual, which is why trigger warnings are required before you mention things that might lead. Sorry, trigger warning as well. I'll be mentioning some triggering things. You always see a trigger warning before you talk about things like child abuse, before you talk about things like sexual assault, because there could be debaters who have experienced these things, and mentioning these things could unduly trigger harmful memories of these debaters. So it is an equity violation if you don't warn these debaters, because you're unduly creating harm to them. You're unduly resurfacing these harmful memories. Similarly to why if there was a soldier who had PTSD, you wouldn't just randomly mention things that resemble war to the soldier due to the harmful memories that they have encountered. You do not want to resurface these memories for them because it could create lots of physical pain and mental pain to them. You don't do that in debate as well. So that's the first kind. And the second kind are you unduly harm someone with respect to their gender. I think this is the most, or at least the most, the easiest to explain. You do not there. You create harm to an individual if you misgender them, if you refer to them with a gender that does not belong to them. And so, as much as possible, we ask teams to either one use gender neutral language or to ask before they approach someone using pronouns. Other risks. There is also religion. So if you know, or if you're aware that your arguments might include discourse surrounding religious minorities, always include a trigger warning as well. But I'm sure there's more. Admittedly, I'm not the most qualified to be discussing all the risks of equity violations, but I do think I have identified a fair number of them. Don't infringe upon race, gender, ethnicity, all these things. If you do, you create unfair harm to individuals who seek debate as a safe space. And those are the risks. I don't, if someone asks, if you're an adjudicator and you're going to repeat to the debaters what I just told you, don't do that. Instead, just repeat to them this. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for this speech. As a reminder to all debaters, please be mindful of your language, as we do not want to unduly harm other individuals, as we do not want people to be unduly harmed because of our language, for example. I wish I could give you a better spiel than that. Perhaps the homework for everyone is to work on a spiel like that and be prepared if ever you do encounter an equity violation in the round. Are there, I can answer one last question and then I think I have to go. If there are none, I'd just like to say again, thank you all so much for having me. It was truly an honor. And I actually really enjoyed the Q&A session. Those were some very critical questions, very relevant questions even. And I'm very happy I was given this opportunity and platform to talk about it. Just as an optional homework, if ever anyone wants to exercise the tips and tricks that I've shared here, I highly recommend going on YouTube and looking for this particular round. It's a full BP debate, and it was a very good debate. You can exercise your adjudicating skills by trying to come up with a decision, but more importantly, you can try scoring the speakers in the round and seeing what you come up with. But with that being said, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for having me, and all the best to everyone.
Um,
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for the session. It was very informative. It was a very informative session, and I got to learn quite a few things on my own as well on judging, especially when it came to the buzzwords and explanation. I had never thought of the part you were saying. those particular ways. So this session was really helpful, and we are glad to have had you with us here today. Thanks, participants, also for joining for this session. And that will be the end for this morning session. And we would have the evening session at 7 p.m. GMT. Okay, great.
How about yesterday's sessions that was adjusted to today, 1:30 GMT?
No, that's tomorrow, not today.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. So I think we are free to go
Yeah.
now.
Also, Terku, I'll send you the deck. I'll send you the slides. You can share it with the participants.
Okay, sure. All right. Thanks a lot. All right, guys. So,
Nicolas, please, if you want to reach you privately to maybe find out certain things, how do we get to you?
Okay, you can approach me. Let me grab it first. So there are a few links that I'll be sending in the chat. Just give me one moment. The first one is